Welcome to Echo of Crime YouTube channel. For decades, some of America's most violent crimes sat frozen in time. Case files gathered dust in police archives. Evidence boxes were sealed and stacked in storage rooms. Detectives retired, witnesses moved away, and entire communities slowly accepted a painful truth. Some murders might never be solved. These were the cases investigators referred to as cold, not because they were forgotten, but because every available lead had been exhausted with the tools of the time. In the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, homicide investigations relied heavily on eyewitness testimony, confessions, and basic forensic methods. DNA science existed only in its earliest form, and many crime scenes produced evidence that could not yet be analyzed. Hair samples, blood stains, and biological traces were carefully collected, labeled, and stored, often with the hope that one day technology would catch up. Investigators followed every path they could, but when leads ran out, cases were quietly shelved rather than closed. For families of victims, the passage of time did not bring closure. Birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries became reminders of unanswered questions. Parents grew old without knowing who killed their children. Siblings built entire lives while waiting for a phone call that never came. These families lived with two losses, the loss of their loved one and the loss of justice. Cold cases were not abstract mysteries. They were open wounds carried for decades. Law enforcement never completely let go. Many departments kept cold case units active, even when resources were limited. Detectives revisited old files late at night, rereading reports and re-examining photographs. Sometimes a small detail, a witness statement overlooked years earlier, a timeline inconsistency, a forgotten suspect, would raise new questions. But without new evidence, progress remained painfully slow. The truth was simple. Investigators were limited by the science of their era. Then, quietly, at first, everything began to change. Advances in forensic DNA testing allowed scientists to extract usable genetic profiles from evidence that had been considered unusable for years. Old samples were retested. Partial profiles became full ones. What once seemed like meaningless biological traces suddenly held enormous investigative power. Cold cases that had sat untouched for 20, 30, or even 40 years were reopened. One of the most powerful turning points came with forensic genealogy, the practice of comparing crime scene DNA to public ancestry databases. This method allowed investigators to build family trees and narrow suspects through distant relatives rather than direct matches. The technique gained national attention with cases like Joseph DeAngelo, whose arrest proved that time did not protect killers as much as they believed. The message was clear. Even after decades, evidence could still speak. These stories are not about luck or coincidence. They are about patience, preservation, and persistence. They are about detectives who refused to give up, families who never stopped hoping, and a justice system that finally gained the tools it needed to look backward and move forward at the same time. Before the arrests, before the courtroom verdicts, and before the headlines, there were years of silence and evidence waiting for science to catch up. As technology advanced, cold cases that had remained untouched for decades began to move again, slowly at first, then with growing momentum. Police departments across the country started reopening old homicide files, not because new witnesses had come forward, but because science had finally caught up to the evidence they had preserved. Boxes sealed years earlier were pulled from storage. Swabs, clothing, and biological traces were carefully re-examined. What once seemed like unusable fragments now held the potential to identify killers who believed time had erased their crimes. Modern DNA testing transformed investigations. Techniques became sensitive enough to extract full genetic profiles from tiny or degraded samples, evidence that earlier generations of forensic science could not analyze. Detectives worked closely with forensic labs to retest material collected decades ago. In many cases, results that once came back inconclusive now produced clear genetic markers. These breakthroughs gave investigators something they had never had before, a scientific path forward in cases that had gone completely cold. One of the most powerful tools to emerge was forensic genealogy. Instead of relying solely on criminal DNA databases, investigators began comparing crime scene DNA to public genealogy records submitted voluntarily by people researching their family histories. This allowed detectives to identify distant relatives of unknown suspects and build family trees that narrowed possibilities across generations. The process was slow, methodical, and painstaking, but it worked. In case after case, suspects were identified not because they left fingerprints or confessed, but because their DNA connected them to a family line they could not escape. These investigations required patience and precision. Detectives reconstructed timelines from decades earlier, re-interviewed witnesses who were now elderly, and followed leads that crossed state lines. Many suspects had lived ordinary lives for years, raising families, holding jobs, and blending into communities. Some had never been questioned before. Others had been briefly considered in the original investigations, but cleared due to lack of evidence at the time. DNA changed everything, turning long-forgotten suspicions into solid proof. For victims' families, these developments brought a mix of hope and emotional strain. Each update reopened old wounds. Families had to relive the worst moments of their lives while preparing for the possibility of answers they had waited decades to hear. Some learned that suspects had lived freely for years. Others discovered that their loved ones' cases had quietly influenced major changes in policing and forensic science. Justice, when it finally came, was delayed, but no less powerful. These were not sudden breakthroughs, but the result of years of scientific progress, careful evidence preservation, and relentless investigative work. Killers who once felt safe behind the passage of time were now exposed by technology they never anticipated. The cold cases were no longer silent. They were speaking again, one DNA profile at a time. When arrests finally came in these long-dormant cases, they often arrived quietly. There were no dramatic chases or immediate confessions, just a knock at the door, a warrant, and decades of unanswered questions suddenly rushing back to the surface. Suspects were frequently older, sometimes retired, living ordinary lives that concealed violent pasts. For investigators, this moment marked the end of years of preparation. For families, it marked the beginning of long-delayed truth. Courtrooms became the next battleground. Prosecutors had to present cases built on evidence collected decades earlier, often relying heavily on DNA analysis, expert testimony, and carefully reconstructed timelines. Defense attorneys challenged the age of the evidence, the methods used to collect it, and the reliability of witnesses whose memories had faded. Judges weighed modern science against historic investigations. In many cases, juries were asked to consider crimes committed before DNA testing even existed, yet now solved by it. Some cases ended in guilty pleas, with suspects admitting to murders they believed would never be traced back to them. Others went to trial, where forensic genealogy and modern DNA evidence proved decisive. High-profile convictions reinforced public confidence in these techniques, especially after landmark cases like the arrest and conviction of Joseph DeAngelo, which demonstrated that even serial offenders could be identified decades later. These outcomes sent a powerful message. Time does not protect killers from accountability. Not every cold case resolution brought closure in the same way. In some instances, suspects died before trial. In others, evidence confirmed a suspect's identity, but legal barriers prevented prosecution. For families, answers sometimes came without the satisfaction of a conviction. Still, many described relief in finally knowing who was responsible, even if justice arrived incomplete. Truth, they said, mattered as much as punishment. The broader impact of these cases reshaped law enforcement nationwide. Police departments invested more resources into cold case units. Evidence preservation standards improved. Policies around DNA storage and retesting became stricter. Investigators learned that patience, combined with evolving science, could overcome decades of silence. The success of these cases also sparked ethical debates about privacy, data use, and the future of forensic genealogy, conversations that continue today. Cold cases are no longer defined by impossibility. They are defined by time, technology, and persistence. While not every case will be solved, the ones that are remind the nation that justice can be delayed, but not erased. For killers who believed they were safe after 20 years, the truth arrived quietly, decisively, and far later than they ever expected.